morning Alina Voss arrived in London, the city was already moving without her. Carriages rattled past on wet cobblestones, vendors called out from the corners, women in silk walked arm in arm, and men in tall hats tipped their heads to one another as though they shared a great secret that had nothing to do with her. Alina stood at the entrance of the rented rooms her mother had secured on Brook Street, and looked at the city the way one looks at a locked door they are not certain they have the key to. She was 22 years old. She had £43 to her name, a dress that had been let out once at the waist, and a composure so complete that even her mother could not tell whether she was frightened or simply waiting. Her mother, Clara Voss, was already talking before they had crossed the threshold. Clara was a small, nervous woman who believed with absolute conviction that the London season was the only solution to every problem her family had ever had, including the leaking roof on the barn in Lincolnshire, the outstanding debt to Mr. Alderton the grain merchant, and the fact that neither of her daughters had yet married. Alina, as the elder of the two, was first in line for this solution. Her younger sister, Cecily, had stayed home with their father, who had developed a cough in March that had not left him by June, and who sat in his study most evenings with the account books open, and a look on his face that Alina had learned over the years meant they were losing ground again. Alina did not resent any of this. She was not the kind of woman who collected resentments. She simply saw things clearly as they were without the softening that other people seemed to need in order to function. The family needed money. She was the most likely candidate for securing it through marriage. She had come to London for that reason, and she intended to go about it in the same way she went about everything, carefully, without fuss, and with her eyes open. What she had not accounted for was the sheer peculiarity of London society. She had grown up in the countryside, the daughter of a man who had inherited a modest estate, and then slowly, through bad harvests and worse decisions, allowed it to shrink around him. Her education had been real but unconventional. She had read everything in her father's library, including the agricultural journals and the law books, which were not meant for her but had been left on the shelves without locks. She had learned to ride, to manage the household accounts when her mother refused to look at them, and to shoot with a bow that had originally belonged to her uncle. That last skill had come from old George Fell, the gamekeeper who had worked on the Voss land since before Alina was born. He had taught her the way a person teaches a child who is going to learn one way or the other, properly, so at least they do not hurt themselves. She had shot rabbits, crows, and on one memorable occasion, a weather vane that her father's tenant farmer had bet she could not hit at 40 yards. She had hit it. The farmer had laughed and paid her the 2 shillings he owed, and her mother had been horrified when she heard about it, not because Alina had been gambling, but because she had done it in front of the farmhands, which was not the behavior of a young woman who expected to be received in polite company. London was polite company. London, Alina had been told by every person who had visited it and returned to Lincolnshire with opinions, was a place where a young woman's value was measured in manners, connections, and the willingness to appear to know less than she did. Alina had none of the connections. She had adequate manners. The willingness to appear ignorant was the part she was still working on. The rented rooms were small but clean. The landlady, a Mrs. Horton, came with the property and had an eye that missed nothing and a mouth that missed nothing either. She assessed Alina in a single glance, assessed Clara with the patience of a woman who had spent 20 years dealing with mothers of daughters, and informed them that breakfast was served at 8, the parlor was available until 10 in the evening, and she did not permit gentlemen callers above stairs. Alina thanked her. Clara immediately began asking about the proximity of the rooms to the best addresses in Mayfair, and Mrs. Horton's expression shifted into something politely disinterested, which Alina recognized as the face of a person who has been asked a question they consider beneath them. They unpacked. Clara organized the gowns by color, which Alina thought was less useful than organizing them by occasion, but she said nothing. They had 3 days before the Pemberton ball, which was their first engagement, and the one her mother had been talking about since the letter arrived in April. Lady Pemberton was a connection of a connection, some long-ago friendship between Clara's mother and a woman who had since married into the Pemberton family, and the invitation had come through several degrees of social proximity that Clara had navigated with the determination of a woman crossing difficult terrain. Alina was not sure whether Lady Pemberton knew she was coming or simply could not remember everyone on the guest list. Either way, she was going. Those 3 days were strange. Alina walked. She walked every morning early before the fashionable hours, while the streets were still being swept and the milk sellers were still out. She walked because she had always walked in Lincolnshire, and the absence of open ground made her need to move more, not less. She looked at things. She looked at the buildings, and the people and the way that London arranged itself according to rules that were nowhere written but everywhere enforced, the streets where only servants walked, the parks where only certain people sat, the shops where a woman alone was either invisible or conspicuous, depending on what she was wearing. She was invisible. She had not yet decided whether that was a disadvantage. On the second day, she went to a bookshop and bought a very small book about the history of archery in England, because it was on the discount table and cost almost nothing, and because she was the sort of person who always wanted to understand the history of the things she already knew how to do. She sat in the parlor that evening and read it while her mother repaired the hem on the cream evening gown, and talked without stopping about a woman she had met in the milliner's that afternoon who had told her that the Pemberton ball was going to be attended by at least 3 unmarried men of significant fortune, one of whom was a baron. Elinor said she was glad to hear it and turned a page. The Pemberton ball arrived on a Thursday. Elinor dressed without drama. The cream gown was her best and she knew it, but she also knew that her best was probably the middle of the room in terms of this crowd, which was fine. She was not coming to the ball to be the most beautiful woman there. She was coming to be noticed enough to be spoken to enough to be remembered, and remembered well enough to be invited again. That was the plan. It was a modest plan, but it was realistic, and Elinor had always preferred realistic plans to spectacular ones. They arrived by hired carriage, which Mrs. Horton had arranged, and which smelled of damp wool. The Pemberton house in Grosvenor Square was lit from the inside, and the light spilled out onto the steps in a way that made the evening look warmer than it was. Elinor walked up the steps behind her mother, and was announced by the footman in a voice that carried perhaps 10 feet, which was about what she had expected. The ballroom was large and already full. Musicians played in the corner. Women in gowns the color of jewels moved through the room, and the men wore dark coats and watched the women move. Elinor stood for a moment at the edge of the room and let her eyes adjust to the brightness, as she always did when she entered a new space, and she looked. She noticed him immediately, not because he was the most handsome man in the room, though he was not bad-looking, but because of the way the room seemed to orient itself around him slightly, the way a compass needle finds north. He stood near the center of the floor with 2 other men, and he was not performing the way most men performed at these events, not leaning in eagerly, not looking around for someone more important to speak to. He was simply present, as though there was nowhere else he was supposed to be and nothing else he was supposed to want. He was tall, dark-haired, and wearing the kind of coat that cost more than Elinor's monthly household budget. His face was arranged in the particular expression of a man who has been attending balls for 15 years and has made a separate peace with the entire business. She did not know who he was yet. She looked away. She found her mother a chair and secured 2 glasses of lemonade from a passing footman and began to do the thing she was actually good at, which was watching and learning and figuring out how the room worked. Within an hour she had identified Lady Pemberton, who was kind but scattered, 2 women of about her own age who seemed friendly rather than cutting, a young man who had spoken to her twice with evident interest and then seemed to be called away by his mother, and the general geography of the ballroom well enough to move through it without bumping into anyone. And then she bumped into someone. It happened near the edge of the floor, close to where the footman circulated with the refreshment trays. She turned at the wrong moment. A glass of ratafia, it was not lemonade. The ratafia was a different shade, and she realized this too late, tipped from the tray she had not seen arriving and went directly onto the sleeve of a dark coat. She felt the cold liquid before she understood what had happened. The footman made a small, pained noise. Elinor turned. It was him, the man the room had organized itself around. He was looking at his sleeve with an expression that was very controlled and very still, and then he looked up at her. His eyes were gray, not the interesting gray of a winter sky, just gray, clear and flat and very direct. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that has interrupted them in the middle of a thought they were in the middle of completing. There was no anger in it, not exactly. There was something that was not quite patience and not quite dismissal, but lived in the space between them. She opened her mouth to apologize. She said, "I am deeply sorry, Your Grace," before she even knew for certain that he was a duke, because something about the way the nearest 3 people had gone very still told her that his rank was significant. He said nothing. He looked at her for perhaps 4 seconds, long enough for the silence to become a statement, and then he looked at the footman, and then he turned away. That was it, that was the whole encounter. 4 seconds of grey eyes and silence, and a cold wet sleeve that she had not meant to produce, and then his back, and then the rest of the room again. Elinor stood where she was for a moment, she breathed. She went back to her mother. She did not know yet that those 4 seconds had cost her more than she thought. She did not know yet who he was, Edmund Ashworth, the 5th Duke of Wexford and the man with the longest memory in London. She did not know yet that the two women standing nearest, both with excellent eyesight and excellent social reach, had seen every detail and were already deciding what to do with it. She did not know that the evening had just changed in a way she could not see from where she was standing. She did not know any of it. She finished her glass of lemonade and watched the dancing, and tried to remember the names of the people her mother had whispered to her through the first half of the evening. She went home at 11:30 and took off the cream gown carefully and hung it on the hook behind the door. She lay in the bed in the small rented room and looked at the ceiling, which had a crack in it that ran diagonally from the window to the center, and she thought about the grey eyes and the silence. She thought about the way he had not said a word. She thought about whether the apology she had offered had been adequate or whether she should have said more, or whether more would have made it worse. She decided after a while that there was no perfect version of that moment. She had spilled a drink on a duke. It had been an accident. She had apologized. That was all she could have done, and she had done it. Whatever came next was not in her hands. She closed her eyes. Outside, London went on with its night, its carriages and its lights and its long memory, and Elinor Voss slept without knowing what the morning was already carrying toward her. She woke to sunlight and her mother's voice and the ordinary sounds of Brook Street below, and for a moment, in the space between sleeping and waking, the evening behind her felt small and unimportant, the kind of social brush that happens at every large gathering and is forgotten by the next afternoon. It was not forgotten. Elinor would understand that much sooner than she expected. But for now, in the pale morning of a Friday in June, she rose and dressed and went down for breakfast, and the world outside the window was busy and indifferent and entirely unaware that the quiet young woman from Lincolnshire had already made her first impression on the most consequential man in the room. The impression had not been the one she intended, but it had been made. In London, that was usually enough to begin. She poured her tea, she looked out the window. She did not yet know what the city was already saying about her. She would find out soon enough, and when she did, she would sit with the information for a long, quiet moment, the way she sat with every difficult thing, without panic, without tears, without the performance of distress that other women seem to use as currency. She would simply look at it and think, and decide what to do. That was Elinor Voss. That had always been Elinor Voss, and it was the only weapon she had carried into London, and the only one she was ever going to need. The story that London told about Elinor Voss began with the truth, and then, in the manner of all stories that travel through the drawing rooms and morning calls and carriage rides of the upper 10,000, it grew. Not wildly, it did not grow into scandal or outrage, because Elinor had done nothing scandalous or outrageous. It grew in the quieter, more damaging way of stories that are told by people who are bored and who find a small misfortune more interesting when it is made slightly larger. The truth was this: at the Pemberton Ball on a Thursday evening in June, a Miss Elinor Voss of Lincolnshire had stumbled near a refreshment tray and caused a glass of ratafia to tip onto the coat sleeve of Edmund Ashworth, the Duke of Wexford. She had apologized. He had said nothing. The incident had lasted perhaps 30 seconds and had involved no raised voices, no scene, and no consequence beyond a stained sleeve that was almost certainly dealt with by a very competent valet before midnight. What London received by Saturday morning was something slightly different. Lady Hartwell, who had been standing near enough to see, told Mrs. Cavendish on Friday at 11 that the Voss girl had been terribly clumsy, had nearly knocked the Duke from his feet, and had laughed. Lady Hartwell had not actually heard any laughter, but she had seen Elinor's face after the event, and there had been a kind of steadiness there, a composure that Lady Hartwell found unsettling in a young woman in an embarrassing situation, and she had interpreted it as amusement because she did not have another word for it. Mrs. Cavendish, who was a woman who traded in social information the way other people traded in fabric or horses, passed the story to 3 separate conversations before Saturday tea. By the third telling, Elinor had not merely stumbled but had turned without looking, which was careless, and had spilled the drink with considerable force, and the laughter, which had been an imaginary invention of Lady Hartwell's, had become a confirmed detail. By Sunday the story had acquired one more element. that Elena had not apologized properly, or had apologized in a way that seemed insufficient, or had apologized and then smiled, which was worse than laughing because it suggested she knew what she had done and found it privately funny. None of this was true, but the particular power of this kind of story is that it does not need to be true in order to be effective. It needs only to be believable, and it needs to travel fast enough that the person it concerns cannot catch up to it and correct it in the places where it has landed. Elena could not catch up to it. She did not even know it was running. She found out on Monday. She was at a morning call with her mother, visiting a Mrs. Fenwick, who was a distant connection of Clara's and had been kind enough to receive them. Mrs. Fenwick had a sitting room full of small decorative objects and a daughter named Louisa, who was 17 and had not yet come out, and who looked at Elena with the kind of unguarded curiosity that only very young people still allow themselves in company. Elena liked Louisa Fenwick immediately. She was direct and a little awkward, and she said what she was thinking before she had fully considered whether she should, which Elena found refreshing after several days of London's careful, layered speech. It was Louisa who told her, not deliberately, not with any intention to wound. She mentioned it the way young people mention things they have overheard, as a piece of information that seems interesting and which they have not yet learned to keep to themselves. "Were you at the Pemberton ball?" Louisa asked, during a pause in the conversation between their mothers. Elena said that she had been. "I heard about the Duke," Louisa said, "about what happened with his coat." Elena said, evenly, that she was afraid she had caused an accident with a refreshment tray. Louisa looked at her with the wide eyes of someone who is revising a story they have already formed. "They said you laughed," she said. There was a pause. Elena set down her teacup with great care. "I did not laugh," she said. Louisa looked immediately as though she wished she had not said anything. "I thought it sounded wrong," she said quickly. "I thought it did not sound right when I heard it. I just wondered." Elena smiled at her. It was a real smile, the kind she gave to people she decided she liked, and Louisa looked enormously relieved. "You were right to wonder," Elena said. "It is wrong. I apologized to His Grace at once and I did not laugh. The incident was an accident and I am sorry it happened." She did not say anything more in Mrs. Fenwick's sitting room. She sat through the rest of the call and made conversation with Mrs. Fenwick, and accepted a second cup of tea and noticed, with the careful peripheral attention she had developed over years of managing her father's complicated moods and her mother's fragile hopes, that Mrs. Fenwick was slightly more reserved toward her than she had been at the beginning of the visit. It was a very small shift. Most people would not have noticed it. Elena noticed it. In the hired carriage on the way back to Brook Street, her mother talked about Louisa Fenwick and whether the family had connections that might be useful, and Elena looked out the window and thought. The landscape of her situation was becoming clearer. A story was circulating that made her look foolish and graceless and worse, irreverent about it. The Duke of Wexford was, she had learned in the days since the ball, the most socially significant man in the room she had been in, and perhaps in the room she was likely to enter for the rest of the season. To have offended him was bad. To be known as a woman who had offended him and laughed about it was worse, because it suggested a character defect rather than merely bad luck. She thought about this practically. She could not chase the story and deny it, because chasing it would keep it alive. She could not find the Duke and explain herself, because approaching him directly would appear desperate and would give him the opportunity to be cold to her in public, which would confirm every version of the story that was already circulating. She could not simply ignore it, because stories ignored in London did not die, they fossilized and became permanent. What she could do, she decided, was conduct herself with such consistent and quiet dignity, in every room she entered from this point forward, that the story eventually became implausible. If the version of Elena Voss that people saw every day was composed, intelligent, and perfectly well-mannered, the story of the laughing, clumsy girl would eventually seem like a mistake. Stories about real people only lasted as long as they matched what the people actually appeared to be. This was a slow strategy. It required patience, and it required continued access to the rooms where the story lived, which meant she needed to keep receiving invitations, which meant she needed people to like her enough to include her. She began, quietly and without fanfare, to do exactly that. She was genuinely kind to Louisa Fenwick, who became something close to a friend over the following weeks, even though Louisa was too young to be out and could not directly help Elena's social standing. She was warm to the older women, the aunts and mothers and companions who were often overlooked at social gatherings, because she had noticed that these women saw everything and remembered it, and that they talked to one another in channels that younger women rarely accessed. She was honest, which was a risk in a world that rewarded performance, but she found that careful honesty, the kind that was direct without being unkind, was more effective than the elaborate social fictions that other women constructed and then had to maintain. She did not talk about the Duke, not once in any company. She had learned early in life that speaking about a person who had the power to hurt you was never advisable, because whatever you said would travel back to them eventually, altered, and you would have no control over how it arrived. What she did not anticipate was that the Duke of Wexford was thinking about her. Not frequently. He was not the kind of man who spent time on people who had not warranted it, but Elinor Voss had warranted a small, persistent corner of his attention, and he could not entirely explain why. Edmund Ashworth had grown up understanding that he would be the most powerful person in most rooms he entered, and he had made a practical accommodation to this fact at a young age. He was not arrogant in the theatrical way, the way of men who announce their importance loudly and require visible deference. He was arrogant in the quieter, more thorough way of men who have never genuinely had to question their own position, and who have therefore never developed the habit of doubt. He was intelligent, and he knew he was intelligent, and he found most people less interesting than they appeared to believe themselves to be. He had been told about the story circulating about the Voss girl. His aunt, the Countess of Bale, who told him everything she thought he needed to know, and several things she was merely curious about herself, had mentioned it the day after the ball with the offhand tone of a woman delivering information she does not expect to be important. What she said was, "The girl who spilled on your coat at the Pemberton, there is a story going around that she laughed." Edmund had said she did not laugh. His aunt had looked at him with interest. "You noticed." "I was standing there," he said. She apologized immediately. She was not laughing, she was embarrassed. The Countess of Bale had filed this away with the efficiency of a woman who kept a very tidy mental archive. She did not say anything else about it at the time, but she remembered. Edmund remembered the face. That was the part he found slightly inconvenient, the fact that he could recall it precisely when he had no particular reason to do so. A pale face with dark eyes and a composure that had not cracked even in the moment of genuine mortification. He had been looked at by people in embarrassing situations before, and usually they did one of two things: they over-apologized, growing louder and more effusive as the discomfort mounted, or they went very red and very small, which he found almost as irritating as the loudness. She had done neither. She had looked at him steadily and said the 3 words of apology with a directness that was almost disconcerting, and then she had waited to see what he would do. He had not said anything. He could not remember now exactly why he had not said anything. It had not been unkindness exactly, or perhaps it had been the unthinking unkindness of a man who is accustomed to other people carrying the weight of social interactions. He had looked at her and then turned away, and he had not thought about it for the rest of the evening. But now, a week later, with the story circulating and his own quiet certainty that the story was wrong, he found himself in the mild, unfamiliar position of having been peripherally unkind to someone who had not deserved it, and whose reputation was now suffering for it. This was not a sensation he was accustomed to. He did not entirely know what to do with it. He did not do anything yet. Men like Edmund Ashworth operated on a longer timeline than most social situations. He was patient by nature and strategic by habit, and he was not yet sure what, if anything, the situation required. What he did not know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the story was not going to stay at the size it was. London had a talent for escalation, and the Voss girl had no one in the city powerful enough to interrupt it. By the following week, she would have lost 3 invitations that had previously seemed certain. Her mother would begin to understand that the season was not going the way she had planned. And Elinor herself would sit in the small parlor on Brook Street on a Wednesday evening. With the agricultural correspondence she had quietly been managing for her father spread across the table, and she would look at the numbers and understand very clearly what they meant. They could not stay in London past August. They did not have the money. If the season did not produce a result, they would go home to Lincolnshire with nothing changed except that they had spent the money they could not afford, and the roof would still leak, and the debt to Mr. Alderton would still be there, and her father's cough would still be there, and Alina would be 22 years old in a life that was narrowing slowly in every direction. She sat with those numbers for a long time. She did not cry, she thought. She was not someone who believed that thinking was a substitute for action, but she did believe that acting before you understood your situation was how you made things worse. So she thought first. She mapped it out the way she mapped everything, clearly, honestly, without the comfortable lies that make maps easier to read but less useful. She was losing ground in London because of a story she had not told and could not correct. She had no powerful connections who could interrupt the story on her behalf. She had no fortune that might make the story less important. She had her own character, which she believed was good, and her own intelligence, which she knew was considerable, and the quiet work she had been doing in every room she entered to show people something different from what the story said. It was not enough, not yet. She needed something else. She did not yet know what it was. Outside, a carriage went past on Brook Street. Somewhere further away, a church bell rang the hour. Alina stacked the papers neatly, put them back in the folder, and tied the folder closed. She went to bed. She slept well. She always slept well. It was one of the more useful things about being the kind of person she was, the kind who looked at the hard truth directly and made plans, that the anxiety which kept other people awake at night tended to dissolve once she had looked at it and named it and put it somewhere manageable. Whatever came next, she would be ready. She had always been ready. The question was not whether she had what it took. The question was whether London was going to give her the opportunity to show it. She had not yet stopped believing that it would, and that belief, quiet and stubborn as a weed growing through stone, was perhaps the most important thing she had brought with her from Lincolnshire. Not the composure, not the intelligence, not even the archer's eye that would eventually change everything. The belief that the opportunity would come, and that when it came, she would know what to do with it. She had never been wrong about that before. She was not going to be wrong about it now. The question was only the timing, and timing, in Alina's experience, was the one thing that could not be managed or planned or reasoned into shape. It arrived when it arrived. You simply had to be ready. She was always ready. The city outside did not care about this. The city went about its long night, lit and moving, and indifferent to quiet women in small rented rooms who were lying in the dark making promises to themselves. But those promises had a way of keeping, when the person who made them was the kind of person Alina was. Morning would come, another day would follow. The story was still running and the money was still shrinking, and her father's cough was still in Lincolnshire waiting for her to fix something she could not fix from this distance. But something was going to happen. She was certain of it with the same certainty she had felt at 12 years old, standing at 40 yards from the weather vane, knowing before she drew the bow that she was going to hit it. She closed her eyes, she was ready, she slept. By the 3rd week of June, Alina understood the shape of the damage. It was not dramatic, that was almost the worst part of it. There was no single catastrophe, no public scene, no moment she could point to and say, here is where it went wrong, here is where someone was deliberately cruel. The losses were small and continuous, like a slow leak, and they all added up to the same thing. She was being quietly removed from the edges of the social world she had just arrived in. The first clear sign was the Drummond card. Mrs. Drummond held a weekly informal gathering at her house in Cavendish Square, nothing formal, just an afternoon of cards and conversation that everyone who mattered in that particular circle attended. Clara had received a verbal indication from Mrs. Fenwick that an invitation was likely. The invitation did not come. Clara waited 3 days and then asked carefully through Mrs. Fenwick, and Mrs. Fenwick's reply was gentle and vague and said nothing directly, which was its own kind of answer. The second sign was at Lady Ashby's musicale. Alina was there, she had been invited before the story gathered momentum, and the invitation stood because Lady Ashby was either unaware of the story or had decided it did not concern her. But 3 women who had spoken pleasantly to Alina at the Pemberton ball did not speak to her at the musicale. They did not avoid her obviously. They simply did not notice her, with the practiced selective blindness that London society used as a dismissal that could not be challenged, because it was technically not happening. Alina noticed. She sat through the music with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged in its customary pleasant composure, and she noticed every single person who did not look at her, and she catalogued it all with the precise, unsentimental attention she brought to everything. What she felt about it was a different question. She was not without feeling, she had never been without feeling, despite what her composure sometimes suggested. What she felt was something she would not have called anger exactly, because anger implied helplessness, and she did not feel helpless. She felt a very focused kind of determination. The same feeling she had felt at 12 years old when George Fell had first put a bow in her hands, and she had missed the target entirely for the first 6 attempts and the farmhands had laughed. She had not cried. She had not thrown the bow down. She had stood very still, looked at the target, adjusted her grip by a 1/4 inch, and shot the 7th arrow straight into the center. She was not going to cry now, she was going to find the center. The difficulty was knowing where it was. In Lincolnshire, the center of a target was simple. It was the ring painted on the wood, and you aimed for it, and either you hit it or you did not. In London, the center was made of people and connections, and the invisible traffic of information that moved between rooms she was not always in, and hitting it required a level of social precision she was still developing. What she knew, the story about her had started somewhere near the Duke of Wexford, because he was the person in the incident and his proximity made him the origin point. The story was not accurate. He knew it was not accurate, she was almost certain of this, because his response to the incident had been cool rather than offended, and a man who had been laughed at would have been offended. What she did not know was whether he cared enough about the inaccuracy to do anything about it. He was not her advocate. He had no particular reason to be. She began, without quite planning it, to pay closer attention to the Duke. Not because she was interested in him in the way that other young women were, or at least not primarily for that reason, but because he was, in the vocabulary of her problem, a relevant variable. If the story had come from him, or been allowed to run because he did not deny it, then it would only stop when he had some reason to stop it. If it had been started by someone else and he was merely a passenger in it, then the dynamic was different. She gathered information the way she gathered all information, by being still and attentive in the places where it was available. She learned that the Duke was 31. That he had held the title for 7 years, since the death of his father, and that he had managed the estates well. This last detail she found in a very dry article in an agricultural journal that had somehow ended up in her father's subscription pile, and which she had read because she read everything. The article was about improvements to drainage systems in Northamptonshire, and it mentioned the Duke's land in a footnote as an example of good modern practice. Elinor had found this interesting and had filed it away, not knowing then that it would become relevant. She learned that the Countess of Bale was his aunt, and was considered the most socially formidable woman in his family. The Countess was known for having opinions and expressing them, for being kind to people she found interesting and indifferent to people she did not, and for an absolute refusal to tell anyone she liked what they wanted to hear if what they wanted to hear was not, in her assessment, the truth. She learned that he did not dance much. This was notable at balls where dancing was the primary social mechanism. He attended, he spoke to people, but he did not fill his card. A woman named Agnes Halford, whose mother was a regular correspondent of Clara's from their school days, and who had thus become a kind of informal ally, told Elinor that the Duke was considered to be looking for a wife, but was doing so with such thoroughness that several seasons had passed without a result. "He is too particular," Agnes said. They were walking in Hyde Park on a Tuesday morning, which was when Agnes always walked, and which Elinor had arranged to match. "My mother says he has specific qualities he requires and he will not settle without them." "What are the qualities?" Elinor asked. Agnes laughed. "Nobody knows. That is the part that drives everyone mad. He does not say, he simply looks, and apparently no one so far has been what he is looking for." Elinor thought about this. Then she asked, because she was a person who asked the questions she needed answered even when they were uncomfortable, "Has the story about me reached your mother?" Agnes was quiet for a moment. A duck on the Serpentine said something emphatic and then moved away. "Yes," Agnes said. "She heard it from Lady Norwood on Saturday. And she told me that she does not believe it sounds like you, which is why I am still here." Elinor looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "That is more than most people have offered." "My mother is not most people," Agnes said. "Neither are you, I think, though I am only beginning to be sure of it." That conversation was one of the small good things of that week. There were not many. Clara had begun to understand that the season was not going the way she had hoped, and her method of managing this understanding was to talk about it continuously and in circles, returning always to the same questions. What had gone wrong, whether it could be fixed, whether the expenses could be extended if necessary, whether someone could be approached who might help. Elena answered what she could and redirected what she could not, and in the evenings, after her mother had gone to bed with the mild headache she developed whenever the day had been stressful, Elena sat at the parlor table with the household accounts and did the arithmetic that her mother could not bear to look at. The arithmetic was clear. They had enough for another 5 weeks at the current rate of expenditure. After that, they would need to go home. 5 weeks was enough time if something happened. It was not enough time if everything stayed exactly as it was. Something needed to happen. Elena was not a woman who waited for things to happen to her, but she was also not a woman who invented opportunities from nothing. She needed a real opportunity, and real opportunities came from access, and access was exactly what was being quietly withdrawn. She was sitting with this problem on a Wednesday afternoon when the card arrived. It was from the Countess of Bale. It was an invitation to a garden party at Wexford House on the 27th of June. The invitation was addressed to Mrs. Clara Voss and Miss Elena Voss, and at the bottom in the Countess's hand was a small note. "I have heard a good deal about you, Miss Voss, and find myself curious. I hope you will come." Clara came into the parlor while Elena was still holding it and saw her daughter's face and immediately tried to read the card. Elena gave it to her. Clara read it. Clara sat down. "Wexford House," Clara said, in a voice of controlled emotion. "Yes," said Elena. "The Duke of Wexford. His aunt's garden party." Clara pressed the card to her chest briefly, which was what she did when she was trying not to let her feelings get away from her. Then she looked at Elena with the particular expression she wore when she was frightened of hoping for too much. "What does this mean?" she asked. Elena thought about it honestly. "I do not know," she said, "but I intend to find out." She put the card on the table. She looked at it. The Countess of Bale, whom she had never met, who was the most formidable woman in the Duke's family, had written, "I have heard a good deal about you." That was interesting. What she had heard could have been the bad version of the story, but if it had been the bad version, she would not have described herself as curious. Curious suggested something other than dismissal. Elena found herself thinking for the first time in days that the situation had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not enough to feel safe yet, but slightly. A door she had not seen was apparently ajar, and someone on the other side of it had decided she was worth a second look. She did not know who had caused this. She did not know whether the Duke had said something to his aunt, or whether the Countess had simply gathered her own information, or whether some other chain of events had produced this particular card on this particular afternoon. She would go to the party. She would go, and she would be exactly herself, and she would see what the Countess of Bale was curious about, and she would figure out what kind of opportunity this was. She folded the card and put it in the small wooden box on her dressing table where she kept things that mattered. Then she went back to the parlor and sat down at the table with the household accounts. She had 5 weeks. This card had just possibly made them matter more rather than less. She needed to be ready. She was already planning. But beneath the planning, something else was running quietly, something she did not fully acknowledge even to herself. It was the awareness that the card had come from Wexford House, and that Wexford House meant Edmund Ashworth, and that whatever the Countess's curiosity might produce, the Duke himself was somewhere in the equation. She thought about gray eyes that had held hers for 4 seconds without blinking. She thought about the silence that had not been quite coldness, had been something harder to name. She thought about a man who had heard a false story about her and had known it was false, because he had been there and seen her face. She did not let the thought go any further. She was a practical woman and she had a practical problem, and the way through the problem was clear, and did not involve thinking too carefully about gray eyes. She picked up her pen and returned to the numbers. Outside the window of the rented rooms on Brook Street, London went about its June afternoon, busy and indifferent and entirely unaware that a young woman from Lincolnshire was sitting at a parlor table and thinking very carefully about what to do next. She always thought carefully, she always planned. But she had not planned for what was going to happen at Wexford House on the 27th of June, because some things cannot be planned for. Some things arrive in the shape of an invitation to step out onto a lawn, and everything that follows has to be handled in the moment, with whatever you have in you, and without any time to prepare at all. That was coming, she did not know it yet. She picked up her pen and returned to the numbers, and the afternoon moved on around her, and London kept its own counsel as it always did, patient and enormous and utterly indifferent to the small, precise calculations being made in the small rooms of Brook Street by a woman who had never once in her entire life stopped trying. The morning of the garden party at Wexford House, Eleanor stood at the window of the Brook Street rooms and looked at the sky. It was a clear, pale blue, the kind of summer sky that London produced perhaps 6 times a year and which the entire city treated as a personal reward. The sun was already warm. There would be no excuse to stay indoors. She dressed with care, but not with the anxious deliberateness her mother brought to the activity. Clara had been awake since before 6, going through the 2-day dresses that were appropriate for an outdoor afternoon gathering, and deliberating between them with a thoroughness that suggested the choice would determine the outcome of the entire day. Eleanor let her mother deliberate. She put on the white muslin with the pale blue sash, pinned her hair simply, and looked at herself in the glass with the same neutrality she brought to most things. She looked like herself. That would have to be enough. Wexford House in Mayfair was larger than Eleanor had expected, which was saying something, because she had expected it to be substantial. It occupied a considerable amount of real estate on a quiet street, and had the quiet, certain quality of a building that had been there long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. The gardens at the back, which were where the party was being held, were immaculate, long green lawns running down to a line of old trees, with roses along the borders and a white canopy set up near the terrace for the older guests to sit in shade. Eleanor took it in as she walked through the house with her mother and was announced to the Countess of Bale, and she thought, briefly and practically, about what it would cost to maintain all of this, and concluded that it was a sum of money so large as to be entirely theoretical from where she stood. The Countess of Bale was not what Eleanor had imagined. She had assembled, from the descriptions she had gathered, a picture of a grand, reserved, imposing woman, and the Countess was grand, certainly, but she was not reserved in the way Eleanor had expected. She was sharp in the way of very intelligent people who have reached an age where they no longer feel the need to soften themselves for the comfort of others. She was perhaps 60, with white hair and dark eyes, and she looked at Eleanor for a moment before speaking with an attention that felt like being read by someone who read very quickly. "Miss Voss," she said, "I am glad you came." "Thank you for the invitation," Eleanor said. "Your note was very kind." "It was not kindness," the Countess said. "It was curiosity. There is a difference. Kindness is given without expectation. Curiosity always wants something back." She smiled at this, and it was a genuine smile which Eleanor recognized because it was the kind that involved the eyes. "Do find something to drink and then come back to me in half an hour. I want to talk to you when the crowd has thinned a little, and I can hear myself think." Eleanor found her mother a chair in the shade of the canopy, secured 2 glasses of lemonade from a footman, settled Clara into conversation with 2 other mothers who were clearly also there with daughters, and then moved into the party with the purposeful ease of someone who has learned to be comfortable in rooms where they know no one. She knew a few people. Agnes Halford was there with her mother, and she gave Eleanor a warm look from across the lawn that was reassuring. Louisa Fenwick was not there, she was not yet out, but her mother was, and nodded to Eleanor pleasantly. There were 60 or 70 guests, spread across the lawn in the easy, slightly rehearsed arrangements that outdoor parties produced, and the afternoon had the pleasant, unhurried quality of summer light and good food and space enough to breathe. Eleanor moved through it all, speaking when spoken to, listening more than she talked, watching. She was good at watching. She saw the Duke before he saw her, or at least before he acknowledged seeing her. He was near the far end of the lawn, in conversation with 2 other men, and he was wearing a light grey coat that managed to look exactly as expensive as his dark coat at the Pemberton ball, though it was supposedly more informal. She noticed he was watching the conversation he was in with about half his attention, and the other half was on the garden in general, a habitual alertness she recognized as the kind that people developed when they had spent too many years being the most significant person in a room. She did not approach him. She had not decided yet whether to approach him, and until she had decided, she did nothing. This was a rule she had developed over years of managing situations that were larger than her resources. Do not move until you have decided where to move. The afternoon went on, tea was served, people arranged themselves differently. And then the Duke moved, and people arranged themselves around him differently again, and Eleanor watched this small gravitational shift from a position near the rose border and filed it away. It was his aunt who caused what came next. The Countess of Bale had returned to Alina as promised, and they had been talking for perhaps 20 minutes, genuinely talking, the kind of conversation that both parties are actually present in rather than performing, when the Countess said to someone just behind Alina's shoulder, "Edmund, come and meet Miss Voss." Alina turned. The Duke of Wexford was standing 2 feet away, and he had the expression of a man who has been navigated into a position by someone he loves and trusts and cannot refuse, but who is not entirely sure yet how he feels about the destination. He was taller than she remembered. That was the first thought. The second thought was that his grey eyes at close range were not flat at all. They were, in fact, quite present, and they were looking at her with an attention she had not expected. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. There was a pause. His aunt watched them with the contented expression of someone who has set something in motion and is now enjoying the results. "I owe you an apology," the Duke said. He said it without preamble, directly, as though he had decided to do this and had decided to do it now. "At the Pemberton ball, when you apologized for the accident, I said nothing in return. That was not well done of me." Alina looked at him. She was aware that his aunt was still watching. She was aware that several other nearby people had become very slightly more still, the way people do when something interesting is happening that they are pretending not to notice. "Thank you," she said with the same directness. "I appreciate you saying so. I genuinely did not intend to damage your coat." "I know," he said. "You looked as though you would rather have been anywhere else in England." "I would have preferred to be in Lincolnshire," she said. "But since I was not, I tried to apologize as clearly as I could." Something shifted in his expression. It was very small, the fractional adjustment of a man encountering something he had not expected. "You are from Lincolnshire," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, my family's estate is near Louth." "Good country," he said. "Very good country," she agreed. "Though the drainage in the eastern fields is poor, we have been working on it." Another pause. The Countess of Bale made a small sound that might have been a laugh. The Duke looked at Alina with an expression she could not quite read, not the cool blankness of the Pemberton ball, but something more engaged than that, more attentive. "You manage the drainage," he said. "I manage the correspondence about the drainage," she said. "My father is not well and someone needs to." She was not sure why she told him that. She had not planned to, but she had always believed that the truth said simply was generally better than the edited version, and the question had been direct and she had answered it directly. She watched his face for the reaction, pity, condescension, the social discomfort that some people experienced when confronted with the actual circumstances of people less fortunate than themselves. She did not see any of those things. She saw something that looked almost like respect. The afternoon continued. The Countess guided them away from the rose border toward the lower part of the lawn where the refreshments were set up, and within the natural flow of movement, the 3 of them became part of a larger group, and the specific quality of the conversation dissolved into the broader social texture of the party. Alina found herself a little distance from the Duke, but still within conversational range, and she talked to other people and watched him talk to other people, and she was processing a great deal of information very efficiently. He was not the man the story had implied. Or more precisely, he was a man capable of being exactly what the story implied: cool, removed, unchallenging, but he was also capable of something else, something she had glimpsed in those few minutes near the rose border, and that something else was what she was filing away carefully. She had been at the party for perhaps 3 hours when it happened. The afternoon had progressed into the golden phase of a long summer day, and the light across the lawn was warm and long-shadowed, and someone had set up a target on the south end of the garden, a great gilded archery butt with the colored rings painted on it, because some of the younger men had apparently expressed interest in a display. Alina watched from the terrace with the Countess while 3 young men took their turns. They were not bad shots, but they were not particularly good ones either, and the arrows clustered around the outer rings without distinction. Then the Duke picked up a bow. He was in fact a good shot. Alina could see that from 60 feet away. He drew cleanly and released smoothly, and his arrow went into the gold ring with a satisfying sound that produced applause from the assembled guests. He stepped back. He accepted a glass of something from a footman. He looked, and this was the part Alina would think about later, the part that was important. He looked across the lawn toward where she was standing. She was not sure what she expected him to do. She did not expect what he actually did. He said something to the man nearest him, who laughed. And then he turned back toward the lawn, and his voice carried across the distance between them with the particular quality of a voice that is used to being heard. "Miss Voss, I am told that country girls are very capable with a bow. Perhaps you would like to demonstrate." The world shifted. Not dramatically. The birds still moved in the trees and the roses were still where they had been, and the warm June afternoon was exactly the same temperature it had been 3 seconds before. But the particular portion of the world that was this garden party contracted suddenly around Elena, and she felt 60 pairs of eyes turned toward her with the unified, unhurried attention of people who have been given something to watch. She stood very still. She let the moment be what it was and did not flinch from it. She understood immediately what had happened. She was not a woman who needed time to understand the shape of a situation. He had given her a choice, but the choice was already arranged so that every option visible to the naked eye was a way of losing. She could decline and be known as a woman who had talked about country skills she did not actually have and had been found out publicly and had retreated. She could accept and shoot poorly and confirm every version of the story that had been running for 3 weeks, the clumsy girl, the one who laughed, the one who was nothing she appeared to be. Or she could accept and shoot well, and even then she was not certain what well enough looked like in this particular context, in front of this particular crowd, with this particular man watching. She looked at his arrow in the center of the gilded target. She looked at the bow on the stand near the mark. She felt the afternoon sunlight on the back of her neck and heard the birds in the trees and thought of George Fell's voice, patient and northern and practical. "You are not shooting the field, Miss Elena. You are only shooting the target." She handed her glass to the Countess of Bale, who took it without a word. Then she walked across the lawn to collect a bow. Behind her, the garden party held its breath. She did not hurry. She did not perform confidence. She simply walked the way she always walked, at her natural pace, with her eyes already on the target because the target was where her attention belonged. She reached the stand. She lifted the bow. She felt its weight and balance and the particular give of the string, and she made 3 rapid assessments that no one watching could have known she was making. The Duke of Wexford stood 20 feet away with his glass and his unreadable face, and every person on that lawn was watching Elena Voss, and Elena Voss was not watching any of them. She was looking at the center ring. She was looking at the arrow that was already there. She was thinking about what came next. The bow was too short. Elena felt this before she had finished picking it up. The grip was too close to her body and the draw length was wrong, the kind of bow made for someone with shorter arms than hers, or more likely kept as a garden decoration rather than a working instrument. She ran her thumb along the upper limb without making it look like an inspection, feeling the slight flex that told her the stringing was loose by 2 or 3 pounds from what it should be for accuracy at this distance. None of this was going to stop her. She had learned on a bow in worse condition than this. She simply needed to adjust. She stood at the mark, which someone had chalked on the grass perhaps 45 feet from the target, and she looked at the target with the same unhurried attention she gave to everything she was about to do properly. The gilt ring at the center was perhaps 6 inches across. The Duke's arrow was embedded just slightly left of the very center, which meant he drew with a fractional natural tendency to the left that he had not corrected for, or had not needed to correct for at this range. The fletching on his arrow was visible, dark gray, 3 feathers, set in a slight spiral. She was going to have to account for the loose string. That meant drawing harder to compensate for the reduced tension, which meant adjusting her anchor point by a small degree. She breathed out once slowly through her nose. Around her, the garden party had done that thing that crowds do when something unexpected is about to happen, a kind of collective stillness that is not the absence of life but the holding of it, everyone present and paying attention all at once. She was aware of this the way she was aware of the wind direction and the length of the shadows on the grass. It was information and she filed it, and then she set it aside. She brought the bow up. Her left arm rose and straightened without thinking about it, the muscle memory of 10 years doing the work without being asked. Her right hand came back to anchor at the corner of her jaw, the way George Fell had taught her, not at the chin the way some books showed, but at the jaw because that was the more stable point for a longer draw. She felt the string load. She felt the bow resist her, that small living tension that was the thing she had always loved about archery, the push and pull of it, the dialogue between intention and material. The loose string meant she was working harder than the bow was designed to ask of her, but she had worked harder before. She looked at the target, just the target, Not the Duke, not the 60 pairs of eyes, not her mother somewhere behind her who had almost certainly stopped breathing. The gold ring, the arrow already there. She had done this before. Not this exactly, not in a garden in Mayfair with London watching, but the essential thing, the finding of the center, the stillness before the release. She had done it in rain and in cold and in the early morning with mud on her boots and her father's tenant farmer laughing at her misses, and she had always found it eventually, because she was the kind of person who found things. She released. The world did not pause. That was not how reality worked, and Elena was not the kind of woman who needed the world to pause for her. The arrow left the string and crossed the 45 feet in a fraction of a second and struck the shaft of the Duke's arrow at a point approximately 4 inches behind the nock and drove through it. Both halves fell to either side of the target. Elena lowered the bow. She looked at the target for a moment, confirming what she had done, and then she looked at the crowd. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted them. 1. The moment of general incomprehension, the brain of the assembled gathering processing what it had just seen. 2. The moment of comprehension arriving, rippling through the crowd from the people nearest the target outward. 3. The moment of decision, the question of how to respond to something so far outside the expected range of events. 4. And then it broke. They applauded, not politely, not the measured, careful clapping of an audience acknowledging a competent performance at a concert. This was real applause, involuntary and startled, the kind that happens when a crowd is genuinely surprised into admiration. A few people laughed, but it was not the laughing at kind. It was the laughing because they did not know what else to do kind, the release of tension that had been building since she picked up the bow. Elena stood where she was and let the applause be what it was. She did not bow, she did not smile broadly. She nodded once, the way she had seen her father acknowledge a compliment he considered deserved, and then she turned to return the bow to the stand. The Duke of Wexford was standing very still. She had expected, she was not sure what she had expected. Displeasure, perhaps, or the kind of rigid composure that men adopt when they have been outperformed in public and do not wish to show that they know it. Or even genuine displeasure, which would have been understandable. He was not any of those things. He was simply still, in a way that was different from the stillness he had worn at the Pemberton ball. That had been the stillness of a man who had already decided what he thought. This was the stillness of a man who was in the process of deciding, and the process was happening right now visibly, and she could see it. She walked toward him to return the bow, because the bow stand was near where he was standing, and because she was not going to walk a longer route around him to avoid passing close. She passed close. She set the bow back on the stand. She was aware that he had turned slightly to watch her do this. She looked up at him. "Well shot," he said. It was quiet enough that the people immediately nearest might not have caught all of it. His voice was steady and his face was composed, but there was something in the gray eyes that was not composed at all, something she could not name exactly, an unsettlement she had not expected to find in a man who did not seem to be the kind of man who became unsettled. "Thank you," she said, and because she did not see any reason not to, "I hope your coat is recovered." She watched him take that in. She watched the slight adjustment of his expression, not quite a smile, not quite not a smile. He said nothing further. She gave him one small nod and walked back across the lawn toward where the Countess of Bale was standing with her glass, and an expression of the greatest contentment Elena had ever seen on a human face. The Countess handed her back her drink. "Well," the Countess said. "Yes," Elena said. "You have shot before." "Many times." The Countess looked at her with the sharp dark eyes that missed nothing. "Did you know you could do that, split the arrow?" Elena considered the question honestly. "I have done it before," she said. "Not recently, I was not certain, but I thought the odds were good." The Countess laughed. It was a real laugh, full-throated and genuine, and several people nearby turned to look, because it was not the kind of sound the Countess was known for making in company. "The odds were good," she repeated, as though committing it to memory. "My dear Miss Voss." "I did not come here to miss," Elena said. The Countess looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said, "I rather thought you did not." The afternoon continued, but it continued differently. The thing that had happened with the arrow had changed the texture of the party the way that weather changes the texture of a landscape. The hills are the same hills, the trees are the same trees, but the light is different, and so everything looks different, and people find themselves in different moods than they had expected to be in. People who had not spoken to Elena before the archery display found reasons to speak to her now. Not all of them, some of the guests were cautious in the way of people who are not yet sure which direction things are moving and who prefer to wait before committing. But enough of them that Elena spent the next 40 minutes in a stream of new introductions and conversations that she managed with the calm competence of someone who had been practicing exactly this for weeks. Her mother found her. Clara's face was a complicated mixture of things, joy and disbelief, and a kind of pride that had not had an outlet in some time, and underneath all of it, barely visible but there if you knew where to look, a relief so profound it was almost physical. "Elena," Clara said, arriving at her side and taking her arm with a grip that was slightly too tight. "I am fine, Mama," Elena said. "That was," Clara began. "Yes," Elena said. "I did not know you could. You knew I was a good shot. I did not know you were that good." Elena looked at her mother's face and felt something warm and steady in the center of her chest. "Go and sit down," she said. "You look as though you need tea." Clara laughed, which was good. Elena sent her toward the canopy and turned back to the party, and she felt the world, just for a moment, just the quiet specific world of this particular afternoon, arranged differently than it had been 3 hours ago. She did not think she had solved everything, she was too clear-eyed for that. One impressive shot in a garden did not correct a 3-week-old story, did not restore the invitations she had not received, did not change the fundamental facts of her situation. She knew this. But she had changed something. She could feel it in the way people looked at her and in the way they did not look away. She had walked out onto that lawn as a young woman with a damaged reputation, and she had stood at the mark, and she had sent an arrow straight through the center of the problem. Not the solution, just the center of the problem. There was still a great deal between here and the solution. The Duke of Wexford was at the far end of the terrace, in conversation with 2 men, and she checked once briefly, because she needed to know he was not looking at her. He was talking to the men in front of him, and his face was composed, and he was doing nothing to indicate that the last 20 minutes had happened at all. But his arrow was in 2 pieces on the ground near the target, and everyone at the party had seen her put it there. That was not nothing. In London, that was a very great deal. She accepted a cup of tea from a passing footman and sipped it, and watched the garden party find its new shape around her, and she thought about what came next. She always thought about what came next. That was her nature and her discipline, and the thing that had kept her family's estate from complete collapse while her father sat in his study with accounts he could not bear to add up. The thinking never stopped. It was not exhausting, the way other people seemed to find their own thinking. It was simply what she did, the way breathing was what she did, continuous and unremarked. What she thought now was this: something had begun today that had not existed this morning. She did not know yet what it was or where it led. She knew only that the Countess of Bale was watching her with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose plans were proceeding, and that the Duke of Wexford across the terrace had said "well shot" in the voice of a man who had been genuinely surprised, which she suspected did not happen to him often, and that the arrow was in 2 pieces on the ground, and that London had seen it. Whatever came next, the ground had shifted. She had planted her feet at the mark and she had not wavered, and that was not nothing. That was, in the language she understood, everything. She finished her tea. She went back into the afternoon and was herself, exactly herself, in every conversation and every exchange, until the light went golden and the party began to release itself, and the carriages came and the day ended. She did not know, going home, that the next morning would bring something that would alter the calculation entirely. She did not know that the Duke had spoken to his steward before the last guests departed, and that the steward had made a note, and that the note was already on its way to becoming a card addressed to Brook Street. She did not know any of it. She rode home in the hired carriage beside her mother, who was not crying but was very close to it, and she looked at the city going past in the long summer evening light, and she thought. She was still thinking when she got to Brook Street. She was still thinking when she climbed the stairs and took off the white muslin and hung it on the hook. She was thinking in the particular focused way that meant something important had happened, and she was working out all of its edges, the way you work out the edges of a problem to understand what you are actually dealing with. What she was actually dealing with was this: a day that had begun as an ordinary day in a difficult season and had become, By the time the light failed, something she did not yet have the right word for. She put out the candle. She lay in the dark. The crack in the ceiling ran from the window to the center as it always had. For the first time in 3 weeks, she fell asleep without doing arithmetic. Edmund Ashworth had not been surprised by something in 7 years. He had formed this opinion of himself without arrogance, simply as an accurate assessment of his own experience. He had learned, over the course of a life that had given him wealth and position and acute intelligence in roughly equal measure, to read situations quickly and accurately. He read people the way some men read maps, for the essential geography of them, the peaks and valleys that told you what the terrain was actually going to demand. He was rarely wrong. He had been wrong about Elinor Voss. Not dramatically wrong. He had not done her any calculated harm, had not worked against her with intention. But he had looked at her at the Pemberton ball, a pale-faced young woman from somewhere in the country, neat and modest and clearly out of her element, and filed her in a category that he now understood was entirely incorrect. He had made an assessment without sufficient evidence, and the assessment had led to the kind of casual dismissal that he practiced without thinking about it, because thinking about it had never been required. He was thinking about it now. He stood at the far end of the terrace and held a conversation with Lord Ferrers and Mr. Graham about a parliamentary matter that was actually quite important, and which he normally would have been fully attentive to, and he was giving it approximately 40% of his attention. The remaining 60% was occupied by a problem he was not accustomed to having, which was that he could not explain what had just happened. Not the shot itself. He understood the shot. He had grown up around archery and he knew what it took to produce an arrow that split another arrow at 45 feet, and it was a level of skill he had not expected and had not seen before in a woman at a garden party, and the intellectual part of him was quite willing to be impressed by it on purely technical grounds. He was impressed. He had said well shot because he meant well shot, and the fact that the observation had come out as 2 words with approximately the emotional weight of a weather report was simply how he expressed things. What he could not explain was the quality of his attention toward her for the past 3 hours. He had noticed when she walked out onto the lawn with the bow that she had not checked to see if he was watching. Most people in most situations checked to see if he was watching, not because they were interested in him specifically, but because he was the Duke of Wexford, and being watched by the Duke of Wexford meant something in this world, and people wanted to know whether it was happening. She had not checked. She had looked at the target and at the bow and at no one else, and she had shot, and when it was done she had lowered the bow and looked at the crowd with an expression that was not triumph. He was certain of this, but something more like completion. The expression of someone who has done what they came to do. And then she had walked to him to return the bow, and she had said what she said, and he had said well shot, and she had said I hope your coat is recovered, and there had been something in her eyes when she said it that was not quite humor and not quite challenge and was both at the same time, and he had not had a word for it in the moment, and he still did not have a word for it now. Lord Ferrers said something about the committee. Edmund said something responsive without consulting his actual thoughts. Mr. Graham nodded seriously. The conversation continued. His aunt found him 20 minutes later, appearing at his elbow in the way she had always appeared at his elbow since his childhood, suddenly, without warning, and with an expression that told him she had something to say and had been waiting for the right moment. "Walk with me," she said. He excused himself from Lord Ferrers and Mr. Graham and walked with her along the border of the garden, where the roses were doing their best work in the late afternoon light. His aunt was quiet for a moment in a way that was not her ordinary quiet. She was composing something. "Miss Voss," she said eventually. "Yes," he said. "What do you make of her?" Edmund considered this with the seriousness it deserved, because his aunt asking him what he made of someone was never a small question. "She is not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I am not certain. Whatever I expected, it was not what she is." "Which is?" He thought about it. He walked beside his aunt through the rose border, and the afternoon light was warm and long-shadowed, and the party behind them was a pleasant murmur of voices and movement, and he turned the question over carefully. "Capable," he said finally, "not in the general way, specifically capable in a number of things that are not typically valued together. She manages the family estate correspondence. She handles her mother without effort. She speaks directly without being blunt in the way that most direct people are blunt. and she can apparently shoot well enough to split an arrow at 45 feet. His aunt smiled. "The drainage," she said. Edmund looked at her. "You talked to her about drainage." She brought it up naturally. "She's not performing, that is the thing." She was talking about the estate the way a person talks about something they actually think about, not something they are hoping you will find impressive. His aunt paused. "I have been doing this for 40 years, Edmund. I know the difference." He said nothing. He walked. "The story circulating about her is wrong," his aunt said. "You know this." "I know it. And you said nothing about it for 3 weeks." He felt this observation the way he sometimes felt his aunt's observations, with the particular discomfort of recognizing a true statement about his own behavior that he would not have chosen to examine. "I had no particular reason to insert myself," he said. "You had every reason," his aunt said without heat. "You were there, you saw what happened. A word from you said clearly in the right company would have finished the story in a week. You said nothing and the story ran, and it cost her invitations she needed." He stopped walking. His aunt stopped too and looked up at him with the dark eyes that had been reading him since he was a boy of 8. "You are not unkind, Edmund," she said. "I want you to understand that I know that, but you are sometimes careless in the way that people are careless when they have never had to think about the consequences of their inattention. The world is arranged to absorb your carelessness and not hers. That is not her fault." He stood with this for a moment. The roses were pink and yellow and a deep red that was almost brown at the center. A bee moved through them without pausing. "I apologized to her this afternoon," he said. "I saw." His aunt tilted her head slightly. "She received it well. She said she hoped my coat had recovered." His aunt's expression, for a fraction of a second, was the closest thing to delight he had seen on her face in years. "Yes," she said, "she did." He looked at the roses. "She is in a difficult situation," he said. "Financially, I mean." She did not say so directly, but it was clear. "It is clear," his aunt confirmed. "They do not have much time in London." "She needs a good marriage." "She needs resources," his aunt said. "Whether that comes through marriage or through some other channel is a separate question, though marriage is what is available to her in this world, which is a limitation I find frustrating on her behalf." Edmund looked at his aunt. "You like her a great deal," he said. "I like people who are exactly what they are," his aunt said. "They are rare. Most people are what they think they are supposed to be, or what they believe other people want them to be, and it makes them exhausting. She is just herself, and what she is genuinely interesting, and yes, I like her a great deal." He turned back toward the party. The sun was moving. The garden party was beginning to shift into its final phase, people collecting their things and saying their goodbyes. He could see Alina Voss near the canopy with her mother, and she was talking to a woman he did not recognize, and her back was to him, and she was doing it again, existing in a space without checking to see if he was watching. He found this quality, now that he had identified it, almost disconcerting. He was accustomed to being watched. He had spent 15 years as the Duke of Wexford, and he had never been in a room, not once, where he was genuinely unobserved for any length of time. The perpetual awareness of his own position had become so normalized that he had stopped noticing it. He noticed now, for the first time in a very long while, that Alina Voss had provided him with an experience he had not had since before his father died. The experience of being in proximity to someone who was not performing for his benefit. He was not sure what to do with this. He was a man who knew what to do with most things, and this was a genuinely new sensation. "Invite her back," his aunt said, as though she had been following his thoughts, which she possibly had. "There are things she is interested in that are worth talking about. I would like to have more conversations with her. You might find, if you took the time, that you would too." He said nothing. His aunt did not require a response. She knew, because she had known him his entire life, that when he did not argue he had already agreed with something and was simply in the process of admitting it to himself. He looked at the garden. He looked at the woman near the canopy. He looked at the place near the target where his arrow, or the two halves of it, was presumably still lying on the grass, and he thought about what it meant that a young woman from Lincolnshire had walked across his lawn without checking to see if he was watching, and had put an arrow through his arrow with a poorly strung bow that was 2 pounds under-tensioned. He had been surprised. He had been wrong in his assessment. He had been careless in a way that had cost someone. He did not know a portion of the London season she could not get back. These things were true. He held them and did not flinch from them, because flinching was not something he did. He had never before found himself in the specific position of wishing he had behaved differently toward a woman he had not yet properly met. It was, he reflected, a somewhat humbling experience for a man who had made a private peace with his own certainty a long time ago and had not revisited it since. He walked back to his guests. He did not approach Elinor Voss again that afternoon. But before the last carriages departed and the garden emptied back into itself, he said something to his steward about the invitations for next week, and the steward made a note, and the note became, 2 days later, a card addressed to Mrs. Clara Voss and Miss Elinor Voss, inviting them to a small informal dinner at Wexford House on Friday. He signed it himself. He did not explain why. It was not his habit to explain his decisions to anyone, which was one of the things his aunt occasionally found irritating about him. He sealed the letter and gave it to the footman to deliver, and went back to his correspondence, which was considerable, and he tried not to think about Elinor Voss for the rest of the afternoon. He did not entirely succeed. The image that kept returning was not the arrow, though the arrow was impressive. It was the moment just before the arrow, when she had stood at the mark with the bow raised and the crowd watching and 60 people waiting to see what she would do, and she had not looked around. She had simply looked at the target and been still, and then she had done the thing. He had been in enough difficult rooms himself to know what that cost. He had been, by long necessity, a man who could stand in difficult rooms and be still and do the thing regardless. He had assumed, without examining the assumption, that this was a quality he shared with very few people. He was revising the assumption. He went to his study and answered 3 letters and reviewed the accounts for the northern estate and spoke to his steward about a matter involving a tenant farmer in Northamptonshire. And then he had dinner alone, which was his preference on evenings when he had a great deal to think about, and he thought. By the time he went to bed, he had thought his way to a conclusion that he recognized, in its clarity and its completeness, as the kind of conclusion that did not need to be revisited. He had arrived at it by the same method he arrived at all his conclusions, by looking at the evidence carefully and following it to wherever it actually led, rather than wherever he had initially assumed it would. The evidence led somewhere he had not anticipated. He was not unhappy about this. He was simply, for the first time in a long time, uncertain about exactly how to proceed, and he found that he did not mind the uncertainty as much as he would have expected. He slept well. He usually slept well. In the morning he would write the note to his steward. In the following days there would be a dinner, and after the dinner there would be whatever came next, and he would meet each of those things when they arrived, with the full attention he gave to everything that mattered. He had decided that Elinor Voss mattered. He was not yet certain in what way or in what degree or where the full extent of the matter led. But the decision itself was made, and Edmund Ashworth, once he had made a decision, did not waste time wondering whether he had made it correctly. He simply moved forward. He moved forward. The city went on around him, dark and indifferent and full of its own business, and somewhere in Brook Street a young woman was asleep without doing arithmetic for the first time in 3 weeks, and neither of them knew yet what the arithmetic was eventually going to add up to. But it was adding. Every day it was adding quietly in the way that real things accumulate, not in sudden dramatic leaps, but in the small, certain accumulations of attention and honesty, and the slow, steady work of 2 people trying to see each other clearly. It was adding, the sum was coming. London told the story of the arrow the way London told all great stories, immediately, enthusiastically, and with the particular energy of a city that had been handed something more interesting than the ordinary material of a summer season. By the morning after the Wexford garden party, the account had reached the breakfast tables of perhaps 40 households. By the afternoon it had reached a further 60. By Sunday it was everywhere. What was remarkable about this particular story, unlike the one that had preceded it, was that it was accurate. The facts of Elinor Voss stepping forward on the south lawn of Wexford House and splitting the Duke's arrow in front of 60 guests were not capable of embellishment, because the thing that had happened was already so far beyond the expected range of events that embellishment would have seemed impossible. You could not make the story larger. It was already at the ceiling of what people would believe. So it traveled as it was, and it gathered weight from its own accuracy rather than from exaggeration. And by the time it had moved through the drawing rooms and morning calls and club conversations of Mayfair, it had acquired the quality of a story that people feel a personal connection to simply from having been told it, as though being in the room when a great thing happened, and being 2 degrees removed from the room when a great thing happened were nearly the same experience. Elena was not aware of the story traveling. She was in the small parlor on Brook Street on Friday morning when the card from Wexford House arrived, and she read it, and she sat with it for a moment in her customary quiet way before she showed it to her mother. Clara read it and looked up at her daughter with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, hope and disbelief, and the desperate effort not to hope too much. "A dinner," Clara said. "A small informal dinner," Elena said. "At Wexford House?" "Yes." Her mother looked at the card again. "Elena," she said carefully, "do you think?" "I do not know," Elena said. "I genuinely do not know what he intends. I only know that we have been invited and that going is better than not going." This was true, and Clara accepted it, and immediately began to think about what to wear, which was the most efficient way Elena knew to redirect her mother's energy away from speculation and toward action. Elena thought about what to wear for approximately 2 minutes, and then thought about the dinner itself for a considerably longer time. She thought about the Duke of Wexford, who had apologized and meant it, and who had watched her with an attention she could not entirely account for, and who had said "well shot" in the voice of a man who had been genuinely surprised, which she suspected did not happen to him often. She thought about his aunt, the Countess of Bale, who was the most interesting person she had spoken to in London by a significant margin, and who had watched everything at the garden party with the quiet contentment of someone whose plans were proceeding as hoped. She thought about what kind of opportunity this dinner was, and whether she was reading it correctly, and what the range of outcomes was, and how she felt about each one. About this last question, she was honest with herself in the way she tried to be honest about everything. She had formed an impression of Edmund Ashworth in the approximately 4 hours of proximity she had spent in his company, across 2 events, and the impression was more interesting than she had expected it to be. He was not the man the story had implied. He was not the man she had feared when she picked up the bow on that lawn. He was precise and contained and not given to unnecessary speech, all of which she respected because she was the same way. He had apologized directly and without framing it elaborately, which was the correct way to apologize. He had called Lincolnshire good country, which it was, and had seemed to mean it. He had also, she was quietly aware, set up the archery challenge in front of 60 people in a way that she had understood as a test, and the test had had the quality of something that could go badly for her if she failed it. She had not failed it, but she was still sitting with the question of what, exactly, he had intended by it. Had it been calculated cruelty? She did not believe so, and she was generally accurate about cruelty. She could recognize it when she saw it, having watched enough of it in the small social world of rural Lincolnshire. Had it been curiosity? Possibly. His aunt had said she herself was curious about Elena, and people who spent a great deal of time together sometimes developed similar habits of mind. Had it been something else, a recklessness, a testing of his own response to a situation, a way of doing something he could not entirely explain? She did not know. She was going to the dinner, and she was going to find out as much as she could, and she was going to make no decisions about anything until she understood the situation more completely. The week between the garden party and the dinner was strange and good in a way Elena had not expected the London season to be. The invitations that had been withheld began, tentatively, to return. A card arrived from Mrs. Drummond, the same Mrs. Drummond whose weekly gathering had not included Elena, for the following Thursday. Agnes Halford called on Brook Street on Wednesday morning, which was not unusual, except that she brought her mother, which was more significant. Mrs. Halford was a woman who did not make casual calls. She called when she had decided something, and the decision she had clearly made was that Elena Voss was worth the investment of her presence. Elena received them both with the warm composure that was her natural register, offered them tea, listened to what Mrs. Halford had to say about the season and various social matters she considered relevant, and learned a great deal by listening. She also learned, in the careful indirect way of a conversation with a woman who spoke in implications, that Mrs. Halford had heard the Arrow story from at least 3 separate sources, and had formed her own opinion about it, and the opinion was favorable. On Thursday she walked in Hyde Park with Agnes, who told her directly, Agnes was always more direct than her mother, that the story had changed things for Elena in the specific and practical way that social stories always changed things. It had given people permission to reevaluate what they had previously believed, without having to admit they were doing so. People who had accepted the bad story now had a better story to believe instead, and believing the better story cost them nothing and made them feel better, so they were doing it. "It is not entirely fair," Agnes said. They were walking on the north side of the Serpentine, and the ducks were doing their usual indifferent work on the water. "You should not have needed to shoot an arrow to prove that you had not laughed at a duke." "No," Elena agreed, "but it was the opportunity available and I took it." Agnes looked at her with affection and something more complicated. "Are you ever afraid?" she asked, with the genuine curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to know. Elena considered this honestly. "Yes," she said, "on the lawn before I shot. I was afraid." "You did not look it." "Looking afraid does not help," Elena said. "It only takes the feeling and doubles it." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the directness that Elena had always appreciated in her, "What will you do about the Duke?" "What do you mean?" "He has invited you to dinner. People are talking about it." "What are they saying?" Agnes gave her a look. "You know what they are saying." Elena did know. A duke inviting a young woman to a small informal dinner at his own house, 1 week after watching her split his arrow in his own garden, was not a small thing in the language that London used to communicate such matters. People were saying that Edmund Ashworth was interested. People were drawing conclusions and beginning to arrange them into a narrative, because London always needed a narrative, and right now Elena Voss was providing good material. She was not going to speculate about it with Agnes or with anyone, because speculation was a way of turning hopes into expectations, and expectations were a way of losing your balance before you needed it. She was going to the dinner. She was going to see what it was. She was going to deal with it as it was rather than as she had imagined it. "I will have dinner," she said, "and then I will see." Agnes laughed. "You are remarkably steady about things that would unsettle most people." "I am unsettled by them," Elena said. "I simply do not find unsettledness useful." The dinner on Friday evening was small. 8 people, including herself and her mother, in the smaller dining room at Wexford House, which was smaller only relative to the larger dining room and was still the grandest room Elena had eaten in. The Countess of Bale was there, which Elena had hoped. Agnes's mother was there, which was interesting. A Lord Pemberton, not the same Pembertons who had hosted the ball, but a cousin and his wife, and 2 other men she did not know. And the Duke. He was a different person at dinner than he was at a party. She noticed this almost immediately, and she filed it with interest. At the garden party, he had had the quality she had observed at the Pemberton ball, present but contained, managing his own presence in a room full of people who were all aware of him. Here, in a smaller group at his own table with people he clearly knew and trusted, he was more himself. She was not sure how she knew this, but she was certain of it. He was quieter than she had expected, and he listened more carefully than most people did, and when he spoke, he said something specific rather than something social, and the people at the table received it as a contribution rather than a performance. She sat near the Countess' end of the table, and between Elena and one of the men she did not know, a Mr. Calloway, who turned out to be a lawyer of some standing and the owner of a great deal of knowledge about land management, which meant that within 12 minutes Elena was in a genuine conversation about drainage rights and easements that was one of the most technically interesting conversations she had had since leaving Lincolnshire. Mr. Calloway was visibly startled when he realized that she was keeping pace with him. He was the kind of man who was accustomed to explaining things to women rather than discussing things with them, and the adjustment he had to make in real time was visible on his face. Elena did not draw attention to the adjustment. She simply continued talking about drainage rights, and by the dessert course he had settled into the conversation as it was, and they had covered 2 counties' worth of legal precedent and reached an interesting disagreement about a 1806 case involving a contested right-of-way in Norfolk. She was aware, across the table and down its length, that the Duke had been listening to parts of their conversation. She could not have said exactly how she knew this. She had not caught him at it directly, and he had been perfectly attentive to his own conversations throughout. But she knew it the way you know when someone in a room has shifted their attention toward you without looking at you directly. She had always been good at sensing attention. After dinner, when the group moved to the drawing room, the Duke crossed the room to her. He did not approach her with the elaborate social machinery that men often used at these events, the introduction, the comment about the weather, the gradual navigation toward an actual point. He simply arrived next to her and said, "You and Calloway were discussing the Thornton right-of-way case." She looked at him. Yes, she said. He is wrong about it, he said. The 1806 ruling was overturned in part in 1811. The easement held, but the extent of it was narrowed considerably. She had not known this. She felt the small, sharp pleasure of learning something accurate from an unexpected source. I did not know the 1811 ruling, she said. Most people do not. It was a very small case. I only know because one of my father's properties had a related issue in 1812, and my solicitor spent 2 weeks explaining the precedent to me in considerable detail. And now you have surprised me with it at a dinner party, she said. He looked at her with something that was very close to amusement. I thought you would want to know, he said simply. She looked at him. I do want to know, she said. Thank you. They talked for the next hour. The other guests moved around them in the pleasant, unhurried way of a small dinner party where everyone is comfortable, and Eleanor and the Duke of Wexford stood near the window and talked about land law and drainage in Lincolnshire, and the difference in soil conditions between the Midlands and the northern counties, and then somehow about the history of English archery, which led to a discussion she had not expected to be having with a duke on a Friday evening in Mayfair, and which she found she did not want to end. At some point she realized that they had been talking for an hour. At some point she also realized that he was smiling. Not broadly, it was not the wide, social smile she had seen on other men's faces throughout the season. It was a small, contained thing, not unlike the composure she herself wore, the kind of expression that appeared when something was genuinely pleasing rather than when something was required to appear pleasing. And it was there consistently, throughout the conversation, and she was not entirely sure he knew it was there. The evening ended. Her mother made her farewells with a composure that Eleanor recognized required significant effort. The carriages came, the guests dispersed. In the carriage on the way back to Brook Street, Clara was quiet for almost a full minute, which was unusual. Then she said, "He talked to you for an hour." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He did not speak to anyone else for that length of time." "No," Eleanor said. Another pause. "Eleanor," her mother said. "What does it mean?" Eleanor looked at the city going past in the dark, the lamplight and the shadows and the ordinary extraordinary machinery of London at night. She thought about an hour of conversation that had not felt like performance, and grey eyes that were not flat at all when the distance closed between them, and a man who had thought she would want to know about an 1811 legal ruling, and had been right. "I am not certain yet," she said, "but I think it might mean something." She looked back at the passing street. She was smiling slightly in the contained way she had, the way that appeared when something was genuinely pleasing. She did not know if she knew it was there. Clara saw it. Clara looked at her daughter's face in the lamplight of the carriage window and did not say another word for the rest of the ride home, because she was afraid to say the wrong thing and interrupt whatever was quietly beginning. What was beginning was real and significant, and not entirely predictable. Clara was not wrong to feel it. The thing she was sensing was exactly that, real and significant and just beginning. And the woman sitting next to her, who had come to London with £43 and a composure that would not crack, was feeling it too, in the precise, careful, unsentimental way she felt everything. She was feeling it. She was not going to say so yet. But she was feeling it, and that was new, and she carried it home like something valuable, quietly and without making a fuss, the way she carried everything that mattered. The week after the dinner at Wexford House was the week London made up its mind about Eleanor Voss, and the mind it made up was considerably different from the one it had been forming 3 weeks earlier. The revision was not announced. It did not come with an apology for the bad version, because London never apologized for the bad version. It simply updated, with the silent efficiency of a mechanism that had always worked this way, and the update moved through the same channels the bad story had moved through, and arrived at the same breakfast tables and morning calls and carriage conversations, and said, "She is someone worth knowing." The invitations resumed, not tentatively this time, not the careful, probing kind that had begun to arrive after the garden party, but with the confidence of people who had made a decision. Mrs. Drummond's gathering, Lady Ashby's next musicale, an afternoon assembly at Lady Caldwell's house in Berkeley Square, which was one of the more sought-after invitations of the mid-season. Clara received each one with increasing disbelief, holding the cards with both hands as though they might dissolve. Eleanor received them with the same quiet composure she received everything, because composure was not something she turned on and off depending on the news. She read each card, thought about what it represented, and filed it in the category of things that were going in the right direction. She was pleased. She simply did not believe that being pleased required public expression. Agnes called on Wednesday and announced, in her direct way, that she had been told by two separate people that the Duke of Wexford had said something favorable about Eleanor to Lord Caldwell at his club. She was not certain exactly what had been said. These things travelled through layers and lost precision, but the substance of it was apparently that the Duke had corrected the original story about the Pemberton ball and had been clear that Eleanor had behaved impeccably. Agnes delivered this information and watched Eleanor's face for a reaction. Eleanor's face said, "I see." "You do not seem surprised," Agnes said. "I am not surprised," Eleanor said. "I suspected he might say something. He knew the original story was wrong. He has taken some time to say it." "Yes," Eleanor said evenly, "he has." There was a pause. Agnes looked at her with the intelligent, caring attention of a woman who had decided to be a genuine friend, and was therefore not going to pretend not to notice things. "How was the dinner?" she asked, the real answer, not the polite one. Eleanor considered this. She and Agnes had developed, over the weeks of the season, a way of speaking that allowed for the real answer without requiring the performance of the polite one. She appreciated this about Agnes, who had come to understand her the same way Louisa Fenwick had in that first visit, by paying close attention to what was actually there rather than what was expected. "It was interesting," Eleanor said, "more interesting than I expected." "He talked to you for an hour. You heard that?" Everyone heard that. It was a dinner party of 8 people, Eleanor. The talking was audible. Eleanor looked at the window. Brook Street was doing its ordinary summer afternoon business. A child with a hoop went past. "He is more himself than I thought he was," she said. "That is the only way I can describe it. At the Pemberton ball and even at the garden party I could see a version of him. At dinner I saw more than a version." She paused. "He is intelligent and he knows it, which is not automatically a virtue, but he uses it on the problems in front of him rather than to impress people, which is rarer than it sounds." Agnes was quiet, and, she said after a moment, and Eleanor said carefully, "I found I was glad to be talking to him, which is not something I was expecting." Agnes smiled. It was a very warm smile, the kind that she did not deploy carelessly, and Eleanor received it with the particular gratitude she felt for things that were genuine. "Good," Agnes said. "I am not going to speculate about what it means," Eleanor said. "I know I did not ask you to. The situation is still what it is. The finances are still what they are. I am still who I am and he is still who he is, and those two facts have practical implications that do not disappear simply because a dinner was interesting." "I know," Agnes said again, and her voice was kind. Eleanor looked at her. "I am simply telling you where I am," she said, "so you understand that I am not building expectations out of a conversation about drainage rights." Agnes laughed, which was the right response. "A conversation about drainage rights at a dinner party," she said. "Truly, Eleanor, you are one of a kind." What Eleanor did not tell Agnes, what she had not told anyone, because it was not the kind of thing she had practice in telling, was that she had thought about the dinner more than she expected to. Not continuously, not in the way she had heard other women describe thinking about men who interested them, the involuntary and consuming kind of preoccupation that seemed to take up a great deal of space, but at intervals, in the way she thought about things she wanted to understand better. She kept returning to the image of him across the dinner table, listening more than he spoke, and to the quality of his attention when he was talking to her, which was full rather than partial, the way most people's attention was partial. She thought about the small, contained smile that had been there through the conversation about longbows, and whether he had known it was there. She thought about what his aunt had said in the rose border, the words she had not been meant to hear but had, because she always heard things she was not meant to hear when she was paying attention, and she was always paying attention. The Countess had said, "She is just herself, and what she is genuinely interesting." And she had said, "You might find if you took the time that you would too." She thought about those words on the nights when the parlor was quiet, and her mother was asleep, and the street outside the window was doing its night business in the ordinary way of streets in cities that do not rest. She was a practical woman. She knew the facts of her life clearly, and she did not dress them in things they were not. But she was also, underneath the practicality, a woman who felt things, who had always felt things quietly and deeply in the way of people who do not express them loudly. She had simply not had very much occasion in Lincolnshire to feel things about people she had only just met, because the people she met there were people she had always known, and familiarity had its own particular effect on feeling. What she felt about Edmund Ashworth she was not yet willing to name, because naming it would give it a shape that might prove incorrect, and she preferred to wait until she understood something before she committed to a description of it. He called on Thursday. Not at Brook Street. He sent a note through his steward asking whether she would care to walk in Hyde Park on Thursday morning at 9:30, as he had heard the northern bank of the Serpentine was less crowded at that hour, and he thought, given her interest in water management, that she might find the landscaping informative. The note was signed with his name only, no title, no formality, which she noticed. She sent back a note accepting. Her mother spent Wednesday night in a state of careful emotional regulation that involved several cups of tea and 3 separate discussions of whether the walking dress or the blue morning gown was more appropriate, which Elena settled by pointing out that she was walking in a park and not attending a formal engagement, and the walking dress was better suited to paths that were sometimes damp after rain. She walked with him for an hour and a half. She had expected it to be slightly awkward. The formal situation of a duke calling on a young woman to walk in a park had a specific social weight that she thought might make the naturalness of the dinner conversation harder to recreate. It was not awkward at all. They walked, they talked. He told her about the Serpentine in the kind of detail that suggested he had walked there many times and paid attention, and she told him about the fen country near Louth, and then somehow they were talking about the estate again, and she was describing the drainage problem in the eastern fields with the same directness she had used at dinner, and he was listening with the same quality of attention she had noticed then. He asked about her father. She told him honestly without making it dramatic. Her father was not well, he had a persistent cough, he was not managing the estate as he should, and she had been quietly managing what she could from a distance, but there were limits to what she could do through correspondence. What would help him most, the Duke asked. Elena looked at him. A better year, she said, a good harvest, the drainage problem addressed properly, and probably a physician who is more interested in finding the right treatment than in billing for the wrong ones. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know a physician in London who trained at Edinburgh and has done good work with cases that present as you describe, persistent, low-grade, not responsive to the usual approaches. I cannot promise anything, but if it would be useful I could arrange an introduction. Elena stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to look at her, and she looked at him. Why would you do that? She said. She was not being unkind, she was asking the question she actually needed to ask. He looked back at her without flinching. Because it is within my power to do and it would be useful, he said, and because I would like to be useful to you if you will allow it. She looked at him for a long moment. The Serpentine was behind him, pale and silver in the morning light. A swan went past on the water with the magnificent indifference of something that has never doubted its own place. She thought about the question his aunt had put to him in the rose border which she had heard. She thought about a man who had learned things wrong once and then corrected himself without drama. She thought about small smiles during conversations about longbows, and an hour at dinner that had not felt long, and grey eyes that were not flat at all when there was no distance between them. She said, I will allow it. He nodded once, the way she had nodded at the archery target, the acknowledgement of something settled. They walked back. The morning was warm and clear, and the park around them was doing what parks in cities do when the weather is good, filling up slowly with people who were relieved to be outside. Elena walked beside Edmund Ashworth and felt the weight of the season rearranging itself around her, the weeks that had been narrowing opening up into something less measured, something that did not quite need to be counted anymore. She did not say anything else about it, he did not either. They walked to the end of the path and she went home with her mother, who had been waiting at Brook Street with barely managed patience, and he went wherever he went on Thursday mornings, and that was the day. She sat in the parlor afterward with the household accounts and looked at the numbers. They were the same numbers, the roof still leaked, the debt to Mr. Alderton was still there, her father's cough was still there. But something else was there too now, something that had not been there when she had arrived in London on that grey June morning. She was not sure yet what to call it. She sat with it the way she sat with all things, without panic, without rushing to a conclusion, and she let it exist as what it was rather than forcing it into a shape she could name. Outside the window the city moved. Elena picked up her pen. She returned to the numbers as she always did. She was still planning because she was always planning. But for the first time since coming to London, the plan did not feel like a wall she was throwing herself against. It felt like a door that was, slowly and without fanfare, beginning to open. She kept her eyes on the numbers, she kept her pen moving, she worked. Outside the window of the small rooms on Brook Street, summer was at its height, and London shone in it, and somewhere across the city a man with grey eyes was probably also working, because he was that kind of man, the kind who worked. The kind who showed up and applied himself to the things that mattered, and Alina Voss had just, she was beginning to understand, become one of the things that mattered. She did not say this out loud, she barely said it to herself, but she thought it, in the part of her mind that was honest about everything, and she let it settle there, and then she went back to the drainage report for the eastern fields and added up the numbers one more time. The numbers were getting better, slowly, but they were getting better. So was everything else. Edmund Ashworth did not propose marriage on a whim. He did not do anything on a whim. The decision to propose to Alina Voss had been arrived at over the course of approximately 3 weeks, through a process that involved a great deal of thinking and one very direct conversation with his aunt, and by the time he had made the decision he was as certain as he could be, which in his experience was more certain than most people managed to be about most things. He thought about it first in the practical way he thought about everything important, by identifying the relevant facts and examining them without the interference of wishful thinking or inconvenience. The facts were as follows. He had been looking for a wife for 7 years, not actively in the sense of pursuing candidates but open to the possibility, with the specific qualities he was looking for held firmly in mind. He had not in 7 years found anyone who possessed all of them. He had found women who were intelligent but not direct but not comfortable with themselves but not genuinely curious about the world. He had found women who were performing eligibility so thoroughly that he could not find the actual person behind the performance, and he had learned, through 7 years of looking, that the actual person was the thing that mattered because everything else could be learned or acquired or accommodated, but character could not. He had found Alina Voss's character in the space of an arrow's flight and 3 conversations, and the finding had not been subtle. She was exactly what she was. She did not perform for him, which he had established she did not do for anyone, and which meant it was not a strategy for attracting him but a fundamental quality of how she existed in the world. She was intelligent in the way he most valued, not the kind that sought to display itself, but the kind that was simply applied to whatever was in front of it. She managed enormous pressure, the financial pressure of her family situation, with a composure that he had come to understand was not detachment but a different kind of care, the care of someone who has decided that falling apart is not an option and has organized herself accordingly. He also found that the conversations did not end in his head. This was, in his experience, the most reliable indicator. He had had many conversations over 7 years, and almost none of them had continued beyond the room they occurred in. The conversations with Alina Voss continued. He found himself, in the evenings after the dinner and after the walk in the park, adding to the conversation that had not happened yet, wondering what she would make of a particular problem or observation. He had not done this before. It was the thing his aunt had been trying to tell him for years, phrased in the language of finding someone worth knowing. What she had meant was that when you found the right person, the thinking did not stop when they left the room. He asked his aunt to tea one afternoon and told her what he was considering. His aunt listened without interrupting, which was not her usual practice, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. "You have thought about it carefully," she said. "Yes, and you are sure?" "I am as sure as I can be without asking her. I do not know how she feels about the matter." His aunt looked at him with the dark eyes that had always seen too much. "She is interested in you," she said. "I have known that since the dinner. But I would caution you about one thing." "Yes, She is not going to receive a proposal in a drawing room with the expectation that she will simply say yes because you are who you are. She is going to want to know that you understand what you are asking and why. Not as a performance, she would see through that in an instant. Genuinely." "I know," he said. "You have not always been good at explaining why," she said. "You do things and expect the things to speak for themselves. Sometimes they do. In this case, I think you will need to speak." He had thought about this. He walked back from his aunt's house along Piccadilly and thought about what speaking meant, not the formal speech of a proposal, which he was quite capable of producing in the correct register, but the more difficult version, the one where he told her the true things rather than the appropriate ones. He had not been accustomed to telling the true things. He was a man who had been positioned by his life to have everything he said taken at face value, and this had made him careless, sometimes, about whether what he said was the surface version or the version underneath. With Elena Voss, he understood instinctively, the version underneath was the only one that would matter. He called on Brook Street the following Tuesday. His arrival at a time he had not called before was observed by Mrs. Horton, the landlady, with the keen attention she brought to all significant events in her establishment, and he was shown to the parlor with a speed that suggested she understood the occasion was not casual. Elena was there. Her mother appeared in the doorway approximately 6 seconds after he entered the room, with the expression of a woman who has been waiting in the hall trying to decide what to do with herself, and he said, with as much warmth as he had ever managed in a direct social request, "Mrs. Voss, I wonder if I might speak with your daughter privately for a short while." Clara looked at Elena. Elena looked at her mother with the smallest possible nod, which was everything. Clara said she would be upstairs, and left with a speed that was not quite dignified, but was entirely understandable. Edmund sat. Elena sat. The parlor on Brook Street was small and slightly worn and had a crack in the ceiling that ran from the window to the center, and it was the most ordinary room he had been in years, and he found, sitting in it, that it did not matter at all. He looked at her, she looked at him. She was not performing patience, she was simply waiting, the way she waited for everything, with her full attention directed at him. He said, "I should like to tell you several things, and I would be grateful if you would hear them through before you respond." "Of course," she said. He told her first that he was aware of the story that had been circulating about her at the beginning of the season, and that he should have corrected it sooner, and that he had not done so out of the kind of carelessness that comes from never having had to consider the consequences of your own inattention, and that he was sorry for it. She listened without expression. He told her second that he had invited her to the garden party because his aunt had told him she was worth meeting, and that after the archery display, and here, for the first time, something in his composure shifted slightly, he had found that he could not stop thinking about it. Not about the shot, or not only about the shot, but about the fact that she had not checked to see if he was watching, and what that meant about a person. She looked at him steadily. He told her third that the hour at dinner had been the most interesting conversation he had had in a very long time, and that the walk in the park had been the same, and that this was not a small thing in the context of 7 years of conversations that had not continued in his head after they ended, and that hers had continued every day since. He stopped. He had said 3 things, and he had said them clearly, and he felt, sitting in the small, ordinary parlor on Brook Street, the slightly unfamiliar sensation of having said true things out loud to a person who was receiving them as true. He said, "I am asking whether you would consider marrying me, not because you need a solution to your situation, though I am aware that you do, and I would not insult your intelligence by pretending that is not part of the picture, but because I have looked carefully for a long time for someone who is exactly what they are, and it turns out to be very rare, and you are it, and I would like to know you for the rest of my life." The room was quiet. Outside, Brook Street was doing its Tuesday afternoon business, entirely uninvested in what was happening in the small parlor above. Elena looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze and did not look away, because he was not the kind of man who looked away from things he had decided, and he had decided this. She said, "You should know that I am not easy to manage." "I am not interested in managing you," he said. "My father's estate is in considerably worse shape than I have described in public." "I can read accounts," he said. "I would not mind looking at them. I have opinions about drainage that I will continue to hold and express regardless of what anyone else thinks of them." The smallest fraction of a smile appeared. "I know," he said, "I am counting on it." She looked at him, he looked at her. Between them, in the ordinary small parlor with the cracked ceiling and the afternoon light coming through the window at its customary angle, something that had been in the process of becoming settled into what it was going to be, and it was going to be permanent, and both of them knew it. She said, "Yes." He breathed out once slowly, in the manner of a man who has been more tense than he appeared and has just been relieved of it. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, one small nod, precise and complete, the way she did everything. "You should know," she said after a moment, "that I am going to tell my mother now, and she is going to cry." I would expect nothing less, he said. He stood. They were standing in the small parlor in the afternoon light, and he looked at her face, which was composed and warm and entirely herself, and he thought, not for the first time, that he had been wrong in his initial assessment of Elena Voss, and that being wrong was, in this particular case, the best thing that had ever happened to him. She went to the door and opened it and said into the hall, "Mama." He heard Clara Voss make a sound that was not quite a word, and then rapid footsteps, and then tears which were as predicted. He stood in the parlor and listened to a mother and daughter, and he thought about the particular kind of luck that arrives only after you have stopped expecting it, and which feels, when it comes, not like luck at all, but like something you were always moving toward without knowing it. He had been moving toward it for 7 years. He had not known where it was, or what it looked like, or that it was going to arrive in the shape of a young woman from Lincolnshire who managed drainage correspondence and split arrows, and said what she meant without making it more complicated than it needed to be. He knew now. He stood in the ordinary parlor and listened to Clara's joy reverberating through the small rooms of Brook Street, and he was, in the straightforward, unperformed way that was the only way things were real, glad. He had one more thing to do before the day was finished. He would write to the physician. He would write to the estate manager in Northamptonshire about the drainage surveys Elena had described, because he had a surveyor he trusted and he wanted to send him north as soon as possible. He would look at the Voss accounts the moment Elena was willing to show them to him, and he would find the practical shape of the problem, because practical shapes of problems were the thing he was actually good at. He was going to be useful to her. He had told her that on the bank of the Serpentine, and she had said she would allow it. He was going to be useful for the rest of his life, which was a different ambition than the one he had arrived at the season with, and a considerably better one. The crying in the rooms above had taken on a more joyful quality. He straightened his coat. He waited for Clara Voss to compose herself, because he was a patient man, and because he was aware that she had been waiting for this for a great deal longer than he had. He waited. He was entirely willing to wait. He had learned in the past few weeks that waiting, the right kind of waiting, the kind that was actually paying attention rather than holding position, was not a passive thing at all. It was its own form of action. It was what you did when what was happening mattered too much to rush. What was happening now mattered too much to rush. He stood in the parlor and waited, and Elena's mother composed herself upstairs, and the afternoon light moved across the floor in the way that afternoon light moves across floors in small rooms, slowly and warm, and everything was, in the truest and most ordinary sense, exactly right. Elena Voss and Edmund Ashworth were married in October, on a morning when London had finally decided to produce autumn properly, all gold and grey and cool air that smelled like leaves and the first fires of the season. The ceremony was in the church on the corner nearest Wexford House, which was the Duke's church and therefore a serious building, old and stone and high-ceilinged, and the morning light came through the east window and fell across the floor in long pale rectangles, and there were 30 people in attendance, which was small for a wedding of this significance and exactly right for the two people being married. Clara cried through most of it, which Elena had predicted and planned for, and which caused Louisa Fenwick, who was there as a guest and had been barely containing her excitement since the announcement was made in September, to produce her own handkerchief and cry in sympathy, which she had not planned to do. Agnes Halford stood at the side of the church with her mother, and watched with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has seen something through to its right conclusion. The Countess of Bale stood at Edmund's side, and was the driest-eyed person in the building, because she had known how this was going to end since the afternoon she sat in the rose border of her own garden, and watched Elena walk across the lawn to collect a bow. The wedding breakfast afterward was not elaborate by the standards of the people in attendance, but it was warm and well-fed and genuinely happy, and Elena moved through it with the same contained warmth she had always carried, speaking to people she knew and people she was only beginning to know, holding the thread of the morning steady and real. At some point in the middle of the breakfast, the Countess of Bale appeared at her elbow with a glass of something, and the expression of a woman who has accomplished something she set out to accomplish, and is not going to pretend otherwise. "Well," the Countess said. Elena looked at her and smiled, the real smile, the kind with the eyes. "Well," she agreed. "You did not need my help," the Countess said. "I want you to know that I know that you are going to be fine regardless." "I do not know that," Elena said honestly. "I know what the numbers were. I know what 5 weeks looks like when you do not have 6. "You would have found something," the Countess said. with the certainty of someone who had assessed this carefully. You are the kind of person who finds something. Elena considered this. Perhaps, she said, but I am also the kind of person who can recognize when they have been helped and who does not pretend they were not. You helped me, I am grateful. The Countess waved this away with the comfortable impatience of someone who does not collect gratitude but accepts it when it is direct and genuine. I invited you to a garden party, she said. You did the rest. I split an arrow in your garden. In front of 60 people, the Countess said. Which was the right choice at the right moment with the right equipment or the wrong equipment as the case was, but still the right choice. Was it? Elena said. It was a real question. She had wondered in the weeks after what would have happened if she had declined. If she had said no thank you and walked back to her mother without the bow. Whether the story would have continued, or whether the evening would have produced some other small turning point through some other channel. Yes, the Countess said. Because of what it told him, he needed to see it. He needed to see that I could shoot. He needed to see that you were not afraid of him, the Countess said. He has lived his whole life surrounded by people who are afraid of him or afraid of what he represents and who adjust themselves accordingly. The adjustment is so common he had nearly stopped noticing it. You did not adjust. You picked up the bow and you shot, and you were exactly yourself doing it, and that is what changed his mind about everything. Elena was quiet for a moment. Across the room, Edmund was talking to Lord Pemberton with the quality of attention she had come to know as his natural register in company, fully present, listening more than speaking, giving the conversation the weight it deserved. He looked from here like a man who was comfortable in his own life. She thought he was. She thought she was going to be interested in the question of what that comfort looked like over the years to come, and what she was going to learn about it, and what he was going to learn about her. He is not simple, Elena said. No, the Countess agreed. He is complicated and occasionally stubborn, and very rarely wrong about the important things, which makes the occasions when he is wrong considerably more frustrating than they might otherwise be. You will find this out. I expect I will. And you, the Countess said, looking at her with the sharp, affectionate attention she had always given her, are you happy? Elena looked at the word. She turned it over in the way she turned over things she wanted to understand before she claimed them. Happy was a large word. It contained a great deal, and she was a careful person with large words. Yes, she said, I think I am, not in the way I thought I would be, not in the way I imagined it when I imagined it at all, but in the actual way. The way it really is. The Countess nodded as though this was the correct answer. The actual way is better, she said. It is heavier and it has inconvenient edges and it is harder to hold, but it is real and real things are worth more. They stood for a moment in companionable silence, in the warm room full of people who were mostly eating and talking and doing the pleasant work of a wedding breakfast. Eleanor's mother was seated near the window with Mrs. Halford and appeared to be describing the ceremony with considerable detail and evident happiness. Louisa Fenwick was eating cake with an expression of complete satisfaction. Agnes caught Eleanor's eye from across the room and gave her the warm smile, the one she did not deploy carelessly, and Elena received it with the gratitude she felt for genuine things. Edmund looked up from across the room and found her. He held her gaze for a moment, the grey eyes that were not flat at all when the distance closed, and then he gave the smallest nod, precise and complete, in the manner she had first seen him use when he had decided something and was acknowledging it. She returned it in kind. She thought about Lincolnshire, which she would see again in December when they went north for the winter months, and about her father, who had received the physician Edmund had arranged, and who had begun a course of treatment that seemed, in the letters that came weekly, to be producing some real improvement. She thought about the accounts, which she had shown Edmund on the second Tuesday of their engagement, and which he had looked at with the attention of a man who was not going to pretend the situation was different from what it was, and which had resulted in a plan produced by both of them together that had the quality of something that would actually work. She thought about the roof, which was going to be repaired in November, and about the debt to Mr. Alderton, which was no longer a debt because Edmund had settled it with the quiet efficiency he brought to problems he had decided were his to solve, which had made Elena feel both grateful and something more complicated, the particular feeling of being helped in a way that understood you. She thought about all of it and she held it, all the actual, real, heavy things that made up the substance of a life, and she thought, yes, Yes, this is what I came to London for, though I did not know it when I came. She had come for a solution. The solution had arrived in a shape she had not imagined. The shape it had arrived in was real and specific, and not at all what the plan had specified, and she was precisely and genuinely glad. A woman beside her said something pleasant, and she turned and replied, and the conversation went on, and the breakfast went on, and the morning went on. And Eleanor Voss, who was Eleanor Ashworth now, which was going to take a certain amount of adjustment even for a woman who dealt well with adjustments, stood in the warm October light of a room full of people who wished her well. She was, in the actual way, the way it really was, exactly where she was supposed to be. Outside, London was doing its autumn business, busy and moving and indifferent as it always was, but it was also now a city she knew. A city she had navigated from £43 and a stained sleeve to a real life, through steady work and honest dealing and one well-placed arrow on a summer afternoon. She had not won London's approval by becoming what London expected. She had won it by being precisely what she was, in every room, at every mark, under every kind of watching. That was what she was going to tell the children someday if they asked, not the version where the Duke was transformed by love and the girl was rescued by it. The true version, which was better and harder and more interesting. She had come to London with a clear eye and a steady hand, and the knowledge that missing was always possible but never acceptable, and that if you stood at the mark and breathed out and looked at the center of the thing, and drew back and held the tension exactly right, and let go at the right moment, you could split the arrow. You could always split the arrow if you had practiced long enough and were not afraid. She had been afraid at the mark. She had told Agnes so, and it was true. She had been afraid, and she had shot anyway because she had learned at 12 years old in a field in Lincolnshire that fear and accuracy were not enemies, that they could exist together, and that the second one did not require the absence of the first. That the only requirement was steadiness, and she had that. She had always had that. The breakfast went on. October moved through the windows in long slants of pale gold. Edmund made his way back across the room to her. In the unhurried way he moved through spaces he was comfortable in, and when he reached her he stood beside her the way people stand when they are in a place they have decided belongs to them, easy and complete. He said nothing, she said nothing. They stood in the warm room, and the morning was still going, and everything that had happened to bring them to this particular moment was behind them. The spilled drink and the cold silence, and the story that ran too fast and the arrow that changed everything, and the dinners and the walks and the truth said simply in the small ordinary parlor with the cracked ceiling. All of it was behind them now, settled and real and belonging to everything that came after. What came after was beginning right now. Eleanor looked at it the way she looked at all things, clearly, honestly, without the softening that other people needed. She looked at it and she was ready, and it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. The Countess of Bale found a chair and sat in it, and accepted a cup of tea and watched Eleanor Ashworth move through the room with the satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something important and is at peace with it. Around her the breakfast continued its warm and ordinary work, the eating, the talking, the small exchanges of people who are glad to be in the same room together. Outside the tall windows, London was golden and cool and going on without anyone's permission, the way it always did. But inside, in the particular warmth of this particular morning, something was happening that London did not control and had not planned, and could not have predicted from the information available on the night. A young woman from Lincolnshire had arrived on Brook Street with £43, and a composure that would not crack. Something real was happening, the kind that lasts, the kind that does not require the world to notice it or validate it or tell the right story about it, because it has its own foundation, built from honest words and accurate arrows and the slow, steady accumulation of two people deciding, day by day, that the other one was worth knowing. That was what had happened here. That was all it was, and it was everything. Eleanor stood in the warm room beside her husband and was herself, exactly herself, as she had always been. And that, in the end, was the whole story. Not the story London told, which was already becoming legend, the girl who split the Duke's arrow, the beauty from Lincolnshire, the arch surprise of the season. That story was fine. It was accurate enough, and it was good for entertaining people at dinner parties for years to come, and Edmund would tell it with great accuracy and only moderate self-consciousness, and Eleanor would correct one detail each time, gently and without fail. He had not issued the challenge to be deliberately cruel, she would say. He had issued it because he was used to rooms arranging themselves around him, and had not yet met anyone who would simply pick up the bow. She had picked up the bow, the rest had followed. That was the story. That was always going to be the story. She picked up her glass and took a small, quiet sip, and looked out the window at the golden October morning and was content. She had come to London looking for a solution. She had found, instead, something that did not need that word, something that was not a solution to a problem but the beginning of an actual life, complicated and real and full of the kind of difficulty that is worth having because it comes attached to something you have chosen and would choose again. She would choose it again. She was certain of this with the same certainty she had felt at 12 years old, standing at 40 yards from the weather vane on a cold Lincolnshire morning, knowing before she drew the bow that she was going to hit it. She was going to hit it, she always hit it in the end. It was simply a matter of patience and practice, and standing at the mark without looking away.